Welcome to Tripping Over the Ottoman. I'm David Van Deusen, here with my co-host, Abby.
And if you're new to our podcast, David and I are two super fans from totally different generations that take a deep dive into episodes of the one thing that unites us.
And that is the Dick Van Dyke Show.
And today we're going to be taking a look at the first episode of a two-part episode. And this will actually be our first two-part episode that we've done so far here on the podcast. Is that right, David?
That's right.
Today's episode, the first part, is Laura's Little Lie. And our next episode of the podcast will be taking on that second part of that two-parter, which is called Very Old Shoes, Very Old Rice. Laura's Little Lie is a fabulous episode in that we get, that great intrigue and mystery that the writers are great at, but also I think it just showcases Mary Tyler Moore's just exceptional talent.
This is a season 3, episode 3 episode written by Carl Reiner and Howard Merrill. Interestingly, the follow-up episode to this was written solely by Carl.
I was surprised by that. I didn't know that.
We'll talk more about that in the next podcast. But directed by John Rich, originally written July 23rd, 1963, revised on August 16th, 1963, filmed on August 20th of that year, and then eventually aired on October 9th of 1963.
And do you have any synopsis of this episode?
Let's see. Rob would like to know why Laura disappears every time his insurance agent, Ed Rubin, comes over or calls.
I have the Petries discovered that their marriage is not legally binding after it comes out that Laura lied about her age when she applied for her marriage license.
I have one more. It says, in the first of a two-parter, Rob cannot figure out why Laura seems so agitated around him. He finally learns that it involves a lie she told him years earlier when they got married. A lie that could have disastrous consequences for their future married life together.
Love it.
I would love to know, we go out and do research to find these synopses, how folks end up writing these narratives and summaries.
It's true. And some of them we're getting from books, about the show, but some of them, are just online and you wonder how they came to be.
Who wrote these descriptions along the way? Along with our usual cast members, we have one guest star in this episode, and that's Charles Aidman. Charles played the role of Ed Rubin. Interestingly, Aidman appeared in 2 episodes of the Dick Van Dyke Show, this one, and then My Husband Is Not a Drunk as Glenn Jameson, the hypnotist.
Which are very prominent characters in the episodes. It's not a bit part in the background. I'm surprised that we all just buy it. Okay, I guess he's a hypnotist and he sells insurance.
It seemed to me that he was going to be in more than 2. It just seems like he's in episodes, but just 2.
I was surprised by that too. Yeah, he's great. He's fantastic.
Aidman's career was filled with many recognizable credits starting back in the 1950s that included Richard Diamond, Private Eye. He was on Perry Mason. He was on Peter Gunn, M Squad, Bonanza, Andy Griffith.
Extremely prolific. My favorite is The Twilight Zone. It's basically a little girl gets sucked into another dimension, in her bedroom, and the dad and mom are trying to get her out, and they call their next door neighbor over, who's Charles Aidman, and he's a physicist that just happens to be living next door, and he comes over and gives his professional kind of, but it kind of has the same vibe as the insurance or the hypnotist, he's got this knowledge he's imparting. So, but it's a really fun one though. He's great at it.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the original Twilight Zone because he ended up being the narrator for the reboot of the Twilight Zone that happened in the mid-1980s.
I was so surprised by that. I had no idea.
Sort of a neat tie-in between his original appearance and then the subsequent involvement.
I did read a kind of a cute little story that said that how he became an actor. And it says that he went into the U.S. Navy during World War II. And then he had intended to become an attorney, kind of after that. But when he was in his naval officer training at DePaul University, he took a speech class, and the drama instructor kind of noticed him in the speech class, and he said, would you like to be in a play? And he says, I was cast in the play. This is his first acting experience. And he said, well, I did the play and I enjoyed it. And it was the first play I was in my life, and I've been acting ever since, which I thought was pretty cool.
Sadly, Aidman died at only 68 years of age in 1983 from cancer.
Shame. Now, before we begin with the first scene, just a little bit about the two-part episode kind of thing going on. So in the early 50s, television was really episodic. Every episode kind of just reset to normal by the end, and they didn't run into each other at all for kind of a lot of practical reasons. They were no streaming services. There wasn't even really easy reruns at that point. And so every episode kind of had to stand on its own because that might be the only one someone sees. And also stations used to air stuff out of order, all that kind of thing. And sponsors just wanted people to be able to pop in, see the episode, come out, not be confused. And also TV at that time, it was kind of thought of as disposable kind of entertainment. And so, but then in the 60s, networks started to realize people were very loyal to their shows and things like that. And sponsors got excited by that idea of that loyalty and the ratings going up. So they started employing these two-part episodes, which would end in a cliffhanger, which would entice people to come back for the second episode the week afterwards. And that people would tune in for this. They were excited by the cliffhanger. They wanted to see the resolution. And it kind of proved that audiences were very kind of loyal to their shows, created huge ratings anticipations. And that kind of led on to TV becoming a little more serialized, like stories weaving into each other. And it kind of was the start of all of that. So there's been a couple of major ones people remember from this time period. Batman, the TV show, every single week was a cliffhanger. It was right. The next week was the second part. Star Trek had a couple good ones. And then famously, The Fugitive ended its season in like 1966, 67, or I think it's 67, with a finale, giant two-parter that was huge ratings. It really changed things. And, now, of course, TV's changed and everything. But I think you still see that serialized kind of thing in the shows that are out today.
What was unique about it back then was it was something to look forward to the following week. Like everybody was anticipating and discussing, well, what's going to happen?
Yeah, water cooler talk, right?
And it was the family likely gathering around that TV set at 8 o'clock on Thursday night or whatever. Yeah. So they could all see what the outcome of the unsolved mystery from the week before or whatever the case may be.
And, I kind of miss that feeling of everyone being on the same wavelength. Now there's so many shows, it's hard to even know what anyone's watching. But everyone had this sort of like common thing going on where everyone was watching the same things. That's a really, really cool special thing that TV did then.
Depending on what streaming platform you're talking about, some of them will drop every episode at once.
Yeah, right away. Uh-huh.
Others do not. For example, like Apple says dropping next week.
I appreciate that.
It sort of brings you back to the old school days of the sitcom, I guess.
I miss that. Right? Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. I would just say, too, the two-parters for the Dick Van Dyke Show itself, I believe I counted 6 total. From season 1 with the Stacey Petrie, the I'm My Brother's Keeper, when he's sleepwalking. Then we have this one in season 3. And then in season 3, we also have the one with Sally and, when she's on the talk show and she's spending too much time at work kind of thing. And then we have 4.5 and the Alan Brady Show goes to jail in season 4. And then we also in season 4 have the next Stacey Petrie two-parter. Season 5 has one other two-parter, which is I Do Not Choose to Run, when Rob tries to become the councilman. Those are the ones I saw. I don't think I missed any, but if anyone sees any more that I missed, let me know.
Our episode opens in the Petrie living room with the phone ringing. And in the episode, as it eventually aired, there's very little delay. Rob goes and answers the phone. But intriguing to us is the fact that in the original draft script that we were able to acquire, there was more that went on ahead of that, which was kind of fun. And that is Rob and Laura were both off stage as they could hear the phone ringing. Laura is supposed to come from behind Richie's bedroom area, and Rob was coming from the bedroom to each other. They both say, "Will you get that, honey?" As we don't see them, right? Mm-hmm. Then they both entered to the scene, and Laura says, "Well, Rob, I asked you if you'd get it." Rob says, "Well, I asked you to get it." And Laura says, "Well, I didn't hear you." And he said, "Well, we must have jammed each other or something like that."
Yeah.
So finally, Rob says, "Well, you get it, honey. You made a longer trip." And Laura says, but you're closer to it. So he says, "Well, why do I always have to answer phone?" That's actually where we picked it up in the episode.
Which is Laura says, "Well, you have a better speaking voice." And that's where the aired one picks up. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, I guess they thought it didn't do much for the plot, I guess, but super fun though.
It did show a little bit of back and forth that would have been fun. Like, are you getting it? Am I getting it? Or neither getting it?
Well, and then Rob replies, "Well, thank you, my dear," in that, vampire monster voice he does. Or it's kind of like Victorian or something. And Rob answers the phone and he says, "Oh, hi, Ed," which is we get the first introduction to this Ed Rubin character. And Laura's kind of tidying in the background, fluffing some pillows. And she says, "Oh, Ed who?" And Rob kind of puts his face out of the, "Oh, Ed Rubin." And as soon as his name is mentioned, Laura's demeanor changes completely.
Tenses right up.
Just her face just, with terror. And she's just, very visibly distressed. She kind of freezes there. And so the audience is going, what's this Ed Rubin character? What's going to happen with that? And then Rob and Ed start talking, and he suggests something about, a possible insurance issue. So now we're getting that he might be, involved with insurance. He makes some kind of joke about, a buffalo trampling clause or something in the insurance policy, which is so funny. But and Laura's growing increasingly anxious. She's hearing him talk about this entire thing, Ed asked to come over. Rob says, well, why don't you come over in a half an hour because I want to watch this situation comedy thing, which I always thought was kind of funny, like kind of meta. Like he's in a situation comedy and he's going to watch a situation comedy, which I think is funny.
I just found that dialogue just a little odd. Like, would you say to somebody on the phone, well, could you come over in a half hour? Because I'd like to watch a new situation comedy.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going to watch a show. Yeah, something. It was very specific.
Seems a little wordy to me, but okay.
Yeah, totally. So after, Rob ends the call, Rob tells Laura that, Ed Rubin's going to come over later to discuss something. We get that he's an insurance man. And she's just extremely tense. Her hands are kind of clenched together. And Rob's recognizing something's wrong. Like, he knows her very well. Like, what's happening? And the audience, we're also sensing something's wrong, but we don't know what it is. And he says, well, whenever I mention Ed Rubin's name, you get this way about you. And she says, so what way is that? And he goes, all knotted up. And he kind of points to her hands that are all kind of clenched together,
Yeah, she's annoyed because she said it would have been nice if you asked me before you hung up the phone if he could come over.
He was being kind. He said, well, if you don't want him to come over, let me know. She said, no, go ahead. Don't change on my account kind of thing. So in the one that aired, she says, I'm not knotted. I'm just, I'm a little tired. Rob says, well, Ed Rubin's not going to arrive for half an hour. Why don't you go take a nap? And she says, yeah, I think I will. And she goes toward the bedroom. But in the draft that we have of the script, it's a little bit different, isn't it?
Yeah. Rob says to her, honey, I'm going to ask you something point blank, and you don't have to answer if it embarrasses you. And Laura says, well, what do you want to ask? And Rob says, are you secretly in love with our insurance broker? And Laura sort of looks at him, well, you found me out, so I guess I'll just pack up and be ready to leave when he comes for me. And that's when she exits to the bedroom.
And then Rob has a little bit afterwards where he says, he's laughing a little bit with her. Your alligator suitcase is in my closet. And he says, Rob smiles. I wonder what that's all about. Knowing how well we know the show, I don't know if that would have fit very well about the secretly in love with. I think they were right to cut that. It makes sense to me.
But interesting that it was there originally just to even consider.
Yeah, very.
Well, Rob turns on the TV and starts to watch
his new situation comedy.
Yeah. Although it seems to me like it was gunfire and
it's like a war. Yes. Yeah, I was thinking that too. It was like
what situation comedy is that? I'm not quite sure.
Maybe it was the Guns of Navarone. Yeah, I thought the same thing. I said, it sounds like a Western.
But clearly the music is so loud that Rob does not detect the footsteps of Laura behind him coming out of the bedroom, sneaking out toward the front door, grabbing her purse and leaving the house.
So when we come back, some time has passed. I think it's there's a dissolve kind of where a commercial would have been. And we get that Rob's finishing up his TV program. It's, time has passed. It's ending. And the music stops. He gets up, turns it off. I think he makes a joke like they're like, "Oh, tune in next week," and he's like, "I don't think I'm going to make it." So we get that the show was pretty bad.
And with that, the doorbell rings, and who's at the door but Ed Rubin? Ed comes in, and they exchange some pleasantries as they sort of move toward the living room. And Ed says, "Well, where's your lovely wife, Laura?" And Rob attempts to find Laura to no avail. He looks in the bedroom, and she's not there. And Ed makes a comment, "Well, she really brightens up her room." That's almost a hint back to the dialogue of, are you secretly in love with my insurance salesman? So Ed goes on to explain that he's there because the policy that they had prepared for Laura previously never got returned to him. And he really needs her to do the signatures on the form.
And Rob mentions a couple of things. He mentions that Laura's kind of funny about insurance, like she always has been. And she kind of avoids discussing things, and she always becomes kind of tense. And Ed says, well, that's weird because most housewives are kind of interested in what their husbands, have for insurance kind of thing. And he says, oh, no, not Laura. She thinks I'm going to live forever. And then says something like, I'm going to do my very best to make her happy or something.
And he remarks again about the buffalo trampling clause, which apparently is in every policy that Ed Rubin issues, I guess.
It's a specialty.
Well, Rob cannot figure out where Laura is, so he calls Millie to see if perhaps she's over there. But she's not. Finally, he says to Ed, I seem to have placed my wife. Am I covered for that?
So, yeah, he doesn't find her. The scene 4 starts, and we're back in the Petrie living room, but now it's just Rob. He's at the dining table on the phone. Ed's gone. We get that he's been gone a while. And we get from the phone call that Rob is still trying to find Laura, that she hasn't come home, and it's been quite a while. He looks at his watch. Well, it's after midnight, so we get that she's been gone for hours, which is concerning. The call that we get to hear, we realize he's been on the phone probably all night, but the call we get to hear is with the Bostics, which was really a funny call. He kind of has his last, he's called everybody on the list. He's looking, well, she could be at the Bostic, sort of a last ditch effort who he's going to call. I don't think we've heard them mentioned in the show before. I meant to go back and
No,
look, but I don't remember their name coming up. But sort of low priority neighbors, I guess, or something.
he remarks like out loud to himself, well, she disappeared out of here like Lamont Cranston, right?
Love
So
that line.
probably worth noting, Lamont Cranston was primarily known back in the day as the alter ego of The Shadow, which
Shadow.
was a 1930s radio program.
A lot of times there's this idea that Carl never made any modern references in the show at all. And I think that that is misnomer. Like, I think that the interpretation is lost there. Like, I think maybe how it's told is a little bit wrong. Like, I think it would be more accurate to say is that he generally avoided like major real world contemporary events that would like date the show, like President Kennedy's death or, something big like that. The show just avoids that direct engagement with anything major. But I think there's a ton of small references, though, in the show that probably wouldn't particularly date it, that are kind of people would know it forever, Lamont Cranston, or, there's tons of things like that, little bits throughout. And I think that's more accurate to say that it just avoids the big things that would really set it in the 60s.
I agree. And I think we've touched on those details a
Yeah,
bit as we've dissected some of these episodes of the
definitely.
references that were made, but still keep the show relevant.
They were so minor, it didn't really put the date on it.
Well, Rob decides he's going to call the Bostics to see if Laura is there. Another opportunity for Dick Van Dyke to have a fabulous one-sided conversation.
It's amazing, which you swear is not one-sided.
He talks to Wilbur Bostick, whoever they came up with that
I
name,
love
right?
that name.
And
Milk
and his
toast.
wife's name, Esther Estelle Elaine. He finally arrives at Elaine after trying to stumble through. Apparently, he hasn't talked to Wilbur in a bit.
I was gonna say Elaine.
Ultimately, Wilbur seems to be a little annoyed that Rob is calling so late at night, and Rob just sort of tries to gloss over it and end the call and be done with that. As he hangs up the phone, through the front door comes Laura. Rob sort of jerks to see her, and Laura says, "Oh, well, who are you talking to?" Well, he said, "I was talking to
Wilbur
Wilbur Bostick."
Bostick. The way he says it.
What did he want? And Rob's great line. He wanted to go back to bed.
And then Laura says, kind of the confrontation starts here because he's mad and she's pretending like she doesn't know that he's mad. And she says, "Oh, you call Wilbur? I thought you couldn't stand him." And Rob says, "I can't stand him. That's how upset I was. I called everybody in the whole PTA. Where were you?"
So with a raised voice, he really starts to say to Laura, "Where have you been?" And she's extremely defensive, as you just pointed out. And Laura says to Rob, "You're giving me the third degree." She initially goes and sits down at the coffee table in the living room, and he presses her, and she's flustered there. So eventually she gets up and crosses toward the kitchen and asks if there's any coffee left, and in they go into the kitchen.
Rob kind of inquires, "It's not like you to disappear for 2 solid hours or more without telling anybody, where were you?" And she says, "I went to a movie."
Let me just pick a little bit.
Yeah.
2 hours? Doesn't it seem like more than two
Like
hours have
six.
elapsed?
Yeah. Yes. I was thinking the same thing.
Like she went out at 8, or maybe when the sitcom was going to be on.
I imagine it's prime time sometime. Yeah.
And now he's calling Wilbur at midnight.
Yeah. Which he's already been, I would say at least 6 hours, if I had to put a number on it.
But certainly more than 2, I guess, that he mentions here. Again, it's a nitpick.
Well, and also, if your wife is gone for 2 hours, I don't know if you'd be calling the entire PTA. It's not that long to be, like a big deal.
Laura explains that she left to go see a movie at The Crown,
Yes.
The Horrible Dr. Charming.
I did a little research on this. Did you, David? It's kind of fun.
I did, yeah. Let's hear what you have.
Well, I was first interested in the movie title, if that had any semblance to a real movie, which we can talk about. But I also was interested in the Crown Theater because I thought, well, is that just a chain of theaters? What is that something special they went to? And from my research, it sounds like maybe if she lived in New Rochelle, we're maybe going to go to the Crown Theater. She may have gone to the one in Brooklyn, which was like the most famous one. But it was around that time, and it was one of the bigger theaters. So I'm guessing that might be what they were talking about. And then the movie that they talk about, this Peter Lorre and Vincent Price and the Horrible Dr. Charming, I think is what Rob describes it.
Yes, it's not an actual movie, but most folks feel that it was likely a lighthearted tip of the hat and a humorous nod to those other 1960s horror tropes that had Vincent Price in them and Peter Lorre in them. And actual films of the day had similar names to that.
Mm-hmm.
There was a 62 horror film, The Horrible Dr. Hitchcock, or The Awful Dr. Orloff. So again, I think this is the writing of Carl Reiner, who picks up on something that is there and adds his own little touch to it.
I can't confirm this, but there's a 1963 movie called The Comedy of Terrors. And it's a deliberate parody of horror films from like the 30s and the 50s. And the lineup is Vincent Price, Peter Lorre, Boris Karloff, and some other people. And it's kind of mocking the genre from the outside. I think the plot is like he's a failing funeral director and he resorts to like murdering clients to keep his business afloat or something like that. Something crazy. But the whole thing's kind of a parody. So I thought, well, maybe that could be kind of what they're referring to. Because 63 would have been the same year as this episode coming out. And Vincent Price, Peter Lorre, the title doesn't quite hit it, but I think that might have been something there with people were starting to maybe see more parodies or satires at that time, maybe about horror stuff. So just a thought.
Yeah, this fictitious film name certainly has Carl Reiner written all over
Yes,
it.
it does. Yes, it really does.
Well, Laura is getting increasingly upset, saying that Rob is treating her like a criminal. And Rob is just perplexed since he asked her to go see the movie the week earlier and she didn't want to go. So all of a sudden, his tone sort of softens a little bit as he's trying to figure out what's going on. He gets some coffee and proceeds to fill Laura in about why Ed had come and that he had left some forms there for her to sign.
And she's pretty visibly shaken. As soon as he mentions Ed, it's her hands shaking when she puts it next to her face, and she's just very, very fearful. She's kind of not hearing him. Hey, did you hear me, honey? Oh, yeah, I heard you kind of thing. And back and forth. Rob says, well, wait a minute, I'll go get the forms. And he leaves the room to go get them.
And during this absence while Rob is gone, but even in advance of it, Mary's reactions are great. While he's looking at her, she's trying to put her best face on and smile. And as soon as he turns, she immediately, her fence tases up and you can see.
And this is the first scene, I think, that you're really seeing her talent, just being showcased like that, where it's just kind of Jekyll and Hyde. She's happy, she's stressed, she's happy, she's stressed, kind of going back and forth. And when he leaves the room, we get an even bigger appearance of that, which is she kind of has this like private little breakdown while he's out of the room where she kind
gets
of like
up and spins around and
slams her hand on the table and like kind of stamps her foot, and she's just like, oh, like she's so distressed and overwhelmed and kind of like chewing her nails. And then she realizes like, oh, well, Rob's probably coming back in the room, and so she quickly kind of composes herself, sits back down, forces that like calm smile, kind of thing, right at the second he comes in. It reminded me a little bit of, those episodes where Rob is sort of like the one where he's looking through the mail, but he's really looking for his birthday gift, and he kind of does a bunch of stuff around the room and perfectly times it so when the person comes back through the door, he's doing the same thing he was before. It reminded me of that, and I wonder if she learned a little bit from Dick Van Dyke in that way, because it was like breakdown, oh, boom, right back. As soon as he walks in the door, the timing was perfect.
She does really a magnificent job of that. And like you said, she doesn't want to get caught or detected. So as soon as he comes back in the room, everything is status quo. And she's trying her very best to put that fake smile on her face to lower the temperature of the discussion.
Rob has the forms and he says, well, look, all I could do is fill these out. I'll mail them back to Ed. And then he says, he'll have to call you about the doctor's appointment for the examination. And Laura this is a new potential clue for Rob of the audience, which is like, oh, there's the doctor's appointment is what she's kind of afraid of. She seems very, very distressed by that. Rob makes some joke like, oh, yeah, they got to make sure you're not falling apart to insure you. And ha, 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 that, the scene kind of ends. And she's kind of nervously laughing like, oh, okay, But there's a moment right before the dissolve, which is like Rob has this face where he's taking a sip of coffee and he kind of pauses and looks at her and like, he's realizing it might be the doctor part of it. I want to look more into this kind of thing. You can tell.
So our scene has ended, as you know. We open up to the next morning in a new scene as Rob's crossing from the bedroom through the living room and enters the kitchen just as the phone rings. And sure enough, it's Ed Rubin again on the phone, checking in with Rob to see if he can't talk to Laura and schedule an appointment. While Rob is on the phone, Laura has entered the living room and is overhearing the conversation that's going on in the kitchen. Rob says that he'll go get Laura so she can get on the call to make the appointment. Well, as soon as Laura hears that, she immediately dashes under the counter bar there in the dining room to hide, and Rob comes in looking for her.
Which really reminds me of when Rob hides to find his birthday gift and all that. Those scenes where he's sort of hidden under things. So
Rob heads to the bedroom, and with that, Laura bolts and gets out the front door without being caught by Rob.
She's pretty good at this so far, of escaping.
Rob comes out of the bedroom, not having found Laura. And as he returns to the living room, Richie enters from his room, and Rob asks Richie if he's seen her. And this, I think, is a great line and delivered so well by Larry.
There's a couple in this episode that are pretty great.
Daddy, didn't you see her? She sleeps in your room.
So good. Gets a big laugh from the audience, too. And Rob says, never mind. Pete picks up the phone to talk to Ed. He says, I hate to tell you this, Ed, but I think I misplaced my wife again. And then makes a joke like, I'm not covered for that. Okay. But now there's an interesting part here where Richie picks up the extension in the kitchen. Yeah. And I was trying to think of like, what was the point of that? Is it just to basically get Richie into the kitchen for the next scene to kind of set him there? I never wondered why he picked up the phone and there was this back and forth between them for a minute. I didn't know. I didn't know what role it played for the plot.
That or the other thing I could think of is they're trying to just kill a little time for Laura
Ah,
to get from the front around the back.
that makes more sense.
It
Yeah,
seems a little bit more realistic in terms of the time that has elapsed.
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
As you know, Richie has picked up the extension in the kitchen, and Rob says, "Rich, hang up. I'll be right in." So Rob will go ahead and goes into the kitchen, and they're trying to figure out together where Laura is. And with that, she comes in the back patio door of the kitchen, and Rob sort of looks at her and says, "Where did you go again?" And again, immediately she's very defensive.
What do you mean, where have I been? He says, what do you keep asking me what I mean when I ask you where you've been? She says, because you keep asking me where I've been.
So she deflects. "Richie, sit down and eat your breakfast."
And I love Richie here. He's kind of like the peanut gallery a little bit. For us, it's so fun.
Richie says, "But there's no breakfast on the table." "Well, why don't you have cold cereal and milk?" So Richie continues to ask Rob where Laura had been, where his mom has been. Rob says, "Well, let me get you the cereal and milk." So he goes to the cabinet and gets that. And finally, Laura sort of concedes a little bit, I'd say, and says, "Well, if
Hmm.
you must know, I went out to get the newspaper and then around the back to turn on the water sprinkler. And I hope that satisfies you both." To which Richie says,
I'm satisfied.
"I'm satisfied."
So good. I love that line. He doesn't even look up. He's just putting
Nope.
his cereal. I'm satisfied. Gets such a good laugh too. A lot of great lines this one for Larry, for
For
Richie.
Larry, yeah. So Laura is extremely upset that Rob is making her account for her actions, right? And Rob explains that Ed Rubin called it. This is good. Laura's like,
Yeah.
Ed Rubin, Ed Rubin. The whole world revolves around Ed Rubin.
She's so good at that like pingy voice where she's just like upset to the max. But it's like got this restrained quality, but it's also like really shrill and it's so funny.
And she continues, like under her breath, to mutter his name, Ed Rubin, Ed Rubin.
So she kind of tries to move on from this conversation, kind of deflect, and she says, "Well, Richie, how about a banana for your cereal?" And he says, "Well, I'd rather have raisins." And she says, "Well, dear, I don't have any raisins." Another great Richie line. "That's okay. I'll just pick them out of this cereal." Picks out another little box of cereal.
Did you ever have those boxes of
Yes,
cereal as a
yes.
kid?
Those are my favorite. Yeah.
What were they, like single serving
Yeah,
sizes or
probably
whatever, right?
like a half a cup, you know.
And loaded with sugar, I'm sure.
Yes, yes.
Rob sort of is coming around to this whole situation and says he thinks it probably would be better if he had his breakfast downtown and starts to leave to
Yeah.
head off to work. But before he goes, he explains that the number for Ed or the insurance salesman, he doesn't want to say his name
Yeah.
again
He
after
cuts
she's
cuts
been
himself
muttering
off there. Mhm.
it, is on the application. And away Rob goes off to work.
Yeah.
With that, Laura sort of takes the application and is just so distraught about it. She just crumples it up into a big
Yeah.
ball. She's clearly upset. She's clearly not paying attention to what else is going on in the kitchen. And we have this another great little exchange with Richie's. "Mommy, can I have a glass for my milk?" And she immediately says, "Not before breakfast, Rich. Drink your milk." And Larry sort of looks at her like, so what am I supposed
Yeah.
to do? So with that, he just picks up the entire milk bottle and starts to guzzle it down. With that, Laura wakes up and says, "Rich, let me
What are you
get you a
doing?
glass."
And it's funny the drinking the milk out of the bottle is a thing that they talk that comes up a lot in the episodes. There's one, well, not out of the bottle, Rob, or there's always sort of like these. It must have been like the faux pas of the 1960s kitchen, like drinking this milk out of the bottle. I don't know.
Well, back in the day when the milkman came and delivered your glass bottles to your back
Yeah.
porch.
Yeah, very cool. Well, now we open up on the next scene, which I think is scene 6 at this point, and we're in the writers' room at the office with Buddy and Sally, who often function as Rob's conscience. He's going to bounce off his marital woes with them and get their advice and what are their thoughts on it. So he's talking about the situation with Ed Rubin and Laura, and he says there's something wrong with her. 1 minute she's in the bedroom, next minute she's picking up the paper and doing all these things. And Sally and Buddy are kind of giving him some ideas. Well, maybe she just turned on the sprinkler. He said, well, no, she didn't. She just said that she did. She didn't actually do it. And they have some ideas. And by the way, they're playing cards during this, or we're just playing cards.
Let me take you back
Yeah.
because there was another part of this scene that got cut out that I think is sort of fun. And that is the scene is supposed to open with Buddy lying on the couch and Sally's reading a magazine and Rob is pacing and Buddy and Sally are watching him, right? Sally says to Buddy, the question is he working or worrying? What do you think, Buddy? And Rob is sort of apparently in his old world at this point. And Buddy says, well, I think he's breaking in a new pair of shoes. Sally says, well, he's not wearing shoes. And so is he breaking in a new pair of socks, Buddy says. And Rob says, I'm sorry again. Come on, let's get to work. Where are we? And Sally says, well, I'm on page 32 of Popular Mechanics. Buddy's pretending to be awake, and you're still home fighting with your wife.
And then we pick up with, well, there's something wrong with her. Yeah.
I never noticed in this scene until I read this dialogue, Dick has no shoes on.
Really?
He's walking around in his stocking feet.
I have never noticed that. I don't even know. I don't even note it now that you're saying that. I want to go back and see what I never knew that. Oh, that's fascinating. So they must have filmed part of that.
It was the first time I have ever discovered that Dick was walking around in his stocking feet.
Don't you love it, David, when we discover something new? Because I never think it's possible. And then I'm like, there's one more thing we didn't know.
That is absolutely true.
I love it.
As you pointed out, just before we digressed a little bit, Sally doesn't see anything wrong with Laura going out to get the paper and turning on the sprinkler, except that, as Rob notes, she didn't do either of those things, right? I love the next dialogue exchange with Buddy. Buddy says, well, maybe she heard the ice cream truck.
My wife Pickles, she loves the ice cream truck. She runs out impulsively kind of when she hears the bell go off kind of thing. Which is funny because I always think of Pickles as like a child a little bit. Like she has like there's a reference one time to like her comic books or something on her like bedstand. Like just kind of now she has the ice cream truck. It's kind of adorable.
So despite Buddy's rambling, Rob is sort of in his own little world, sort of talking out loud to himself. And he's like, well, maybe she heard the phone ring. And Buddy says, and thinking that it was the ice cream truck, Sally says she ran out to buy some strawberry life insurance on a stick.
And then Rob's still sort of talking to himself a little bit. Well, no, she ran out to a movie and she knew the insurance man was coming. And she obviously doesn't want to see the insurance man. Why? He's sort of going back and forth, and Buddy and Sally are kind of interjecting. Rob at one point says, yeah, but why doesn't she want to see him? And Buddy responds, well, don't holler at me. I don't even know the guy.
Sally wonders, maybe she doesn't want to see him because he's a wolf. And Rob says, no, Ed's happily married. Finally, Sally says, well, I know why. Laura's avoiding the insurance application because she has to give her correct age.
Which is a little foreshadowing of what's about to come.
It is. Rob says, maybe she doesn't want to have the physical, because he recalls the exchange that they had where she got a little nervous when he talked about having to make the appointment to go to the doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Buddy comes back with a one-liner. Well, maybe he's got a cold stethoscope.
And Sally always the mother, like, will you cut that out? Just trying to fix his marriage here kind of thing. Well, and then Sally says, well, I mean, Rob, do you think she's hiding a condition from you? And Rob says, well, kind of looks that way.
They come around to the fact that the condition could be that she's expecting, right?
Sally says, that's not the kind of condition you would hide from your husband. And Buddy says, oh, yeah, babies are good news.
Rob finally says, I'm going to call her and remind her about calling Ed Rubin.
Rob's dialing the phone, and Buddy and Sally are kind of brainstorming off to the side a little bit. And Sally starts suggesting these reasons. Well, have you gotten heavy insulting her parents lately? And Rob says, no. And Buddy suggests, did you insult her dancing or cooking? Rob says, no. And he says, her baking or shampooing? And so the whole audience laughs at that. And Sally goes, shampooing? And Buddy says, well, yeah, a lot of times when Pickles is washing my hair, she gets shampoo in my eyes and I have to holler at her. And Sally says, your wife shampoos your hair? And Buddy says, doesn't everybody's? It's just hilarious.
Gives you a little more insights into Buddy's and Pickles' marriage.
Their home life must be a riot.
But in the course of the conversation, he says, do you not want to take out this policy? And Laura says, well, why wouldn't I want to take out the policy? He says, well, would you like me to call and make the doctor's appointment for you? And she declines, and she says, Rob, I've got to go. And the call ends, and she quickly terminates their discussion.
And so Rob kind of concludes when he's off the phone, well, I was right. She's hiding, something from me, and it definitely has to do with that insurance policy, and kind of confirms that. So then we open up on scene 7, which is after Rob confirming that for himself. Now he's got a plan. We're in the Petrie bedroom. It's the first time in this episode, actually, we see the bedroom. Laura is putting on a pair of shoes and getting some things out of I think getting her shoes out of the closet, which, David, have you ever noticed the closets in this room and how weird they are?
They are weird.
What is going on with that? It's like there's like a wall up to the clothes, like hang behind a wall almost, from the bottom. It's very strange. I don't know why that is.
I don't either.
So she's, changing her shoes, and she looks like she's going out, and Rob enters. He's carrying an envelope, and he sees Laura. He shuts the bedroom door and he locks it. And Laura says, well, what are you doing? And he says, well, what are you doing? And she says, well, I'm changing my shoes. And did you just lock that door? And he says, that's right. She says, why? He says, because you're changing your shoes. So we get that he knows what's happening. He knows she's about to leave, and he's on it.
And he says, I've been waiting all evening to talk with you about the insurance policy. I didn't bring it up at dinner or anything else. So you knew sort of that this discussion was coming. And Laura says, will you stop acting like E.G. Marshall? So there again, we have another
Yeah.
reference.
Yep.
And Rob says, if you stop acting like a guilty defendant, then I will.
And it kind of escalates a little bit. She gets up towards the door, it goes to the door and says, Rob, give me the key. Like she's going to unlock it. And he says, it's only going to take 30 seconds or however long it takes for you to tell me what there is about an ordinary life insurance policy that can change a fairly normal housewife into a nervous nut. The way he says nervous nut is just a riot.
And he says, you're not going to go until you tell me what's going on.
And with that, Laura does one kind of signal to us, kind of signaling her resignation, which is she kind of waves her hand in the air like, ugh, like it's over. That's it. Like you caught me.
Sort of caves under the pressure finally.
She's already crying, now at this point when she's resigned herself, she's very crying. And I want to say too that Mary Tyler Moore's crying is particularly funny and touching at the same time. I think back to like Lucille Ball, and when she cries, it's funny and it fits the character and fits the story, but you rarely feel moved by her crying. And like, I think it's a real testament to Mary Tyler Moore that you are both laughing and crying with her. You feel for her and you think she's hilarious also. And I think that's a real, I remember hearing once somebody saying that about, a casting person saying that about Jennifer Aniston, that's why they hired her for Friends, is that she could both be funny and sad at the same time. And that was a really hard thing to do. And I see that here with Mary Tyler Moore for sure.
Laura is so upset, she tells Rob that he will never forgive her. And he's sort of inside out trying to figure out what in the world she's talking about. She finally finds the courage to talk to Rob and tell him that she lied to him, pointing out the application. And she points and sort of goes across the room. Rob glances at the application. He says, sex, female? You couldn't have lied about that. So she goes back and points again at the application and points at the age portion.
And by the way, she's doing a lot of good business here. She's got the Kleenex, she's pacing around. Yep. She's just like sobbing and saying like, it's just terrible, in her sort of Katharine Hepburn kind of voice. It's just fun.
And Rob says, well, you lied about your age? And she sort of like nods her head. And he says, well, by how many years? And she holds up 2 fingers. So sort of Rob does the math in his head and determines that Laura wasn't 19 when they got married. And she was actually, I think he refers to as a 21-year-old hag.
Just jeez.
And with that, Laura just wails out loud, no. Suddenly it hits Rob. I married a 17-year-old girl? Well, why did you feel that you had to lie about your age?
When we get that big release too of Laura, like, she's got this big cry of like, that's it. You found it. That's what it was. He's very affectionate though. Everything's going to be fine. It's no big deal. Just relax kind of thing. And they kind of sit down in the bed together. And yeah, he says, how'd you keep a secret like that for all these years is what he says to her. And then she has her great, like, oh, like, yes, I've been keeping it for years.
So he does again say to her, why did you lie? And she says, well, because you probably wouldn't have married me if you knew I was 17, right? And then there's sort of a pause and another pause. And then she says, and we couldn't gotten a marriage license if I had put down my right age. And Rob's like, oh boy. Uh-oh. Oh boy.
Yeah. And I want to say here too, she's actually crying. If you watch the Blu-ray, there are visible tears on her eyes and face. Like she's legitimately crying, which I thought was really, really amazing. She just really got in there.
Rob is suddenly putting all the pieces together and arrives at the conclusion that they probably are not legally married. And Laura says, well, Rob, that's impossible. We have a son. Oh, Rob.
So Rob starts making a call and Laura says, who are you calling? This is my favorite Laura line. And he says, I'm going to call our lawyer. And she says, Marvin? You have one line, a guy's name, and you make it hilarious. It's just such a standout line. Marvin.
And Laura says, well, what are you going to ask him? And Rob says, if I have to sleep in the den tonight.
Which, by the way, is hilarious because you don't even sleep in the same bed.
Exactly.
So Laura kind of collapses onto the bed, just kind of the scene fades out. Last part of the scene is Rob's on the phone, presumably with Marvin. And Laura's kind of standing nearby listening, she's asking him all these questions. What's he saying? What's he doing kind of thing. And he says, just a minute. And he says, Laura, why don't you go listen on the extension? She's like, oh no, I'm too embarrassed.
The discussion is back and forth. And Rob's like, so it's not a big problem. It's a little problem. And again, another little pause or beat. And he says, yes, we'll invite you. And Rob hangs up the phone and Laura says, well.
She says, invite him. And she says, to what? our wedding? He says, yeah, Marvin recommends one.
He recommends a wedding because we got married in one of the few states that insist on accurate and truthful statements on marriage license. Technically, we are illegal.
And that, David and I did some research about marriage laws, and I started thinking about what are the marriage laws in New York at this time in the 60s? You know, how would that have affected? Would they really be illegal? But then David reminded me that they were not married in New York, that they were married at Camp Crowder, Missouri.
Right. Scout and Camp Crowder.
Did not think of that. Yes. So I looked it up. This is what I found. In the 50s, a 17-year-old generally could marry with parental consent. If she claimed to be 19 to avoid needing consent, the marriage was usually still considered legally valid, unless like a court later annulled it for fraud or some other like illegal thing or whatever. So lying about your age didn't automatically make the marriage void. They just kind of looked at it like, have they continued living as a married couple? Has anyone challenged the marriage? Did they meet other legal requirements kind of thing? So in most cases, this probably wouldn't have been something they had to get remarried for. But of course, for the show, you have to insert that drama.
And I did read that just in 2025, they passed a new law about the ages that people can be, and they raised the age.
This is in Missouri?
In Missouri, yeah.
Interesting. And maybe this is a good place to talk about how this episode came to be. It's an article I found on Cracked, I think. And it says, when they first, became cast on the show, Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore, Dick Van Dyke says, I had a couple of problems. For one, I thought, she was a little too young to play my wife. There was some back and forth about that. And then it says, Reiner was correct on a couple of counts. First, the audience had no problem buying Rob and Laura as a couple. And second, Moore must have looked a little older than she was because according to PBS Pioneers of Television, the actress inflated her age to make sure she landed the part of Laura Petrie, which I thought was interesting. Because Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore had almost a 10 or 11-year age gap, depending. So he was about 35 or 36 when they started, and she was, I'm like 25. So she thought, I don't know if they're going to go for that age gap kind of thing. I maybe look too young. So I'm going to tell them I'm like 26, 27, kind of just beef it up a little bit to get it closer, which I don't know if that would have even mattered. They probably would have hired her either way, but she thought that might be a little bit of a fig. So, but anyway, so you wonder, did this real life thing of her kind of fibbing her age a little bit to the producers, did that inspire this episode? I like to think that it did.
I think probably Carl couldn't let it go, just as he did with many other life situations. We could probably write an episode around that in some way, right? With a little liberty here and there. Back to the episode. At this point, Rob sort of looks at Laura and he says, well, why don't we get married tonight? And Laura says, tonight? You mean like elope? And he says, yeah, we can get Millie and Jerry and drive up to Greenwich, Connecticut, get married, and we can stop on the way back to see that movie. And Laura says, well, we really can't do that, Rob. And he sort of looks at her. She says, we don't have a sitter. She says, they'll have to get married the next night. And Rob says, well, oh, darn it, but the movie's not playing tomorrow night.
And then she kind of punches him playfully and it ends. And so you get the cliffhanger, like, where are they going to elope? How are they going to get married? Which, leads us into what I guess you would call a tag or maybe a preview scene, I guess, of the next episode. Kind of the credits roll, and there's this little segment after the credits where Rob, in character, is in the bedroom, and I think he's looking over the insurance policy, in his hand, and he breaks the fourth wall, addresses the audience. He says something like, oh, I hope you can join us next week and watch us get married for the second time. And then he makes some kind of face and says something like, 17-year-old girl, ooh, kind of thing, like, whoops. It's exciting because you're like waiting to see what's going to happen next week. So I think that's really fun. But also I'm like, this is a little controversial, or would be today anyway, I think more so. I mean, presumably, how old was he in the army? I don't even know what that would be. Late 20s, maybe? I don't even know. So it's kind of like, oh, that's interesting. So, but and the fact that he kind of makes that face like, whoops, kind of thing.
It's sort of like shirking down a little bit or something. Can you believe that?
And I wondered at the time, was this controversial? Would this have been in the 60s? Probably not. I don't know if a 10-year age gap would have been a big deal back then. And maybe it isn't even now. What I wondered would have been more controversial for the show was that the mentions of like having Richie and maybe not being legally married.
Right.
Or that kind of thing. And I thought, man, that's kind of bold.
The stigma that would have had back in the 1960s.
That would have been a bigger deal. I think maybe it does show you how lovable the couple is, because we're like, okay, well, even if that's true, like, it's okay because they love each other, and Rob and Laura, like we have something there that's kind of makes it okay for us, a little bit.
A very interesting episode to give Mary an opportunity to really show some great reactions to things. But the interplay between Dick and Mary along the way, and then with Larry throwing in those few funny lines that we talked about. And now we're all set up for the next episode to see, tune in next week. We got to wait a whole week to see what's going to happen.
Yeah, so fun. Well, and then we also get this great mystery element to the episode, which I always love, where the audience we're trying to figure out what's going on right alongside Rob, and it's this great mystery, and you cannot wait to see, what's going to happen. And I love that, and they do that so well in this show.
We hope you've enjoyed today's look back at Laura's Little Lie, and we want to make sure that you tune in next time for our next episode, which will be a discussion of Very Old Shoes, Very Old Rice.
And if you'd like to get notified when that episode or any new episodes become available, just make sure you subscribe to our channel. You can also find us on all the major streaming platforms.
And remember, we are a community, so we value your comments, your questions, your contributions to the discussion surrounding the show. So please feel free to leave some feedback on our channel or send an email to trippingovertheottoman@gmail.com with the subject of Box 7030. And we'd love to hear from you. For today, I'm David.
And I'm Abby, and thanks for tripping over the Ottoman with us. We'll see you next time.